procedures?
Yes, the idea was that he would still be, wouldn't fall too far behind where there's a lot of training to be done on the computer, and then there's data entry and other things he has the ability to learn while working in the dispatch center and having access to a village computer in there.
In fact, during, I guess, the early stages or within a year or so after the accident, isn't it true that Mr. Hull's probation was extended past what would normally be the end date?
Yes, probationary police officer is the probation's for 2 years, because pretty much the first 6 months of the police academy now allows us 18 months to observe the officer to make sure that they're qualified to be a police officer in Wheeling. And because he was no longer working in that role, we asked the Police and Fire Commission to extend it for another year to give him time to recover and get back to work and be evaluated properly.
When Mr. Hull first returned to the police department in that light duty capacity, is it true he only worked two half days or 2 shifts?
Yes.
And did an incident occur while he was working at the Wheeling Police Department?
He claimed that he had gotten dizzy, lost his balance, and slipped out of his chair to the ground.
Did you witness this incident?
I did not.
Did you speak with anyone who was present when the incident occurred?
I was informed about the incident by Deputy Chief Wolf and one of the dispatchers.
After the incident, did you speak with Mr. Hull?
I did not.
Is it true that he was kept off work by the hospital doctor as a result of the incident for approximately a week?
Yes.
After that time period was over or sometime later, did Mr. Hull ask to return to a different position at the Wheeling Police Department?
He agreed to return to a light duty assignment, but didn't want to work in the radio room because of the darkness and the activity in there. So we assigned him to work in the records section, which again, he would have access to computers and data entry and whatnot. And
is it true he remained in this position for approximately 4 days?
It was a short period of time. I don't recall how long.
Do you recall a request or a exchange between the department, either yourself or another individual of which you were aware, regarding Mr. Hull coming back and forth to the police station and driving?
So one of the issues that was raised by Mr. Hull was the fact that he could no longer drive, that he didn't feel comfortable driving and his doctors didn't want him to drive. I don't know if it was myself or my direction to a subordinate to inform him that there's Ubers, there's cabs, there's family members, there's coworkers, and he's not the only one who can't drive, but we still expect him to get to work.
Have you, in your experience at the Village of Wheeling or any other position, encountered an accommodation of providing transportation for a police department employee to and from work?
No, never.
After the second light duty position, did Mr. Hull ever return to work at the Wheeling Police Department?
He did not.
In the fall of 2018, did you find out that Mr. Hull had been working at another position while receiving Pita benefits?
Yes, it was brought to my attention that he was one of the coaches at Cary Grove High School for the boys football team.
And how were you made aware of this?
Someone put a newspaper article on my desk, showed that he was coaching there.
And
somebody put a newspaper article on my desk that indicated that he was coaching there.
And what did you do when you became aware of this information?
I asked Deputy Chief Wolf to look into the matter and to see if, in fact, he had been working there under what circumstances. And subsequently, Cary Grove was FOIA'd for his employment records. And we followed up after that with an internal investigation.
Were you able to confirm that Mr. Hull was employed in some capacity with Cary Grove High School?
Yes.
I believe the record is clear. He completed a application, a background check. He was compensated, even though he indicates that he did not accept the compensation or did not want to. He did. And it's very clear that he was he was employed.
Overruled.
I think it's clear that the application lists voluntary, not an option, either paid or voluntary, and the application lists voluntary.
I'll overrule the objection, then you can ask him those questions on cross.
Chief Dunn, based on the Wheeling Police Department's policies and procedures and the Public Employees Disability Act, as you understand it, would it have been a violation of department policy or Pita for Mr. Hull to have been either working or volunteering, whether paid or unpaid, while he was out on disability?
Would have been a violation of the Wheeling Police Department policy. I don't know about PETA as far as pay or not pay. Definitely, if it was a paid position, it was a violation of statute.
Did you take part in a meeting with Mr. Hull on November 29th, 2018 to discuss any accommodations or additional positions that the department could offer him to continue working at the department or at the village in total?
Yes, he was notified of that meeting. We sent him a letter. It was delivered to him, and we had a meeting was scheduled. Yes, and it happened.
And that meeting occurred with yourself, Mr. Hull, Mr. Michael Crotty from the Human Resources Department, and an attorney from Clark Baird Smith. Is that correct?
Yeah, Paul Dedham, and then also I believe Deputy Chief Wolf was present.
And what was the purpose of this meeting?
Just to ask Mr. Hull if there was any accommodations we would make for him at the police department, and if he was unable to work in the role of a police officer while he was recovering, was there another position within the village that he could possibly work?
So was Mr. Hull asked if there were other positions outside of the police department that he could work in?
Yes.
Could you give us some examples?
Community development, inspecting, of course, the internal jobs we talked about in the dispatch center records, public works as a front desk reception there because currently they don't have one, but we could have tested a position like that. Village hall with filing and or assisting everything here.
And the majority of the questioning at this meeting was done by the attorney, correct? Or Mr. Crotty?
Both Mr. Crotty and Mr. Dedham did the majority of the questions. I spoke specifically about other positions outside of the police department and within the police department.
Could you describe first what you observed of Mr. Hull's demeanor at this meeting?
He was calm and cordial.
Did he come with an attorney?
He did not.
Did he ever ask to come back with an attorney?
No, he did not.
Did he ever tell anyone at that meeting that he was confused about the questions being asked for him?
No, never.
Did Mr. Hull ever tell you that he was interested in being considered for any other position in the village?
No, he was adamant that he could not work any other position in the village or at the police department. When I mean adamant, it was no, I can't do that. No, I can't do it. No, I can't do anything. No.
Did Mr. Hull ever indicate that the village or the police department could provide him with any accommodations that would support his ability to work light duty or even full duty in the police department?
He was asked and the response was no.
After this meeting, did Mr. Hull ever return to work at the Wheeling Police Department?
He did not.
Shortly after this time was Mr. Hull, I'll strike that. Shortly after this time, did you provide a letter to the Board of Police and Fire Commissioners regarding a request for termination or charges against Mr. Hull for violation of policy?
I did. In the totality that he was not doing anything that he had related to me that he was doing to improve medically as he was claiming to me. And after that meeting, which was set up to see if there's something we could do to accommodate him, because we had already extended his probation to try and find something for him to do. And he was totally out of his own personal benefits, and he was out of any possible benefit time. I brought before the Fire and Police Commission documents asking for his removal as a police officer.
Was an additional charge as it may be, the indication that Mr. Hull was working outside of the police department while out on disability.
That was the second charge, yes.
Now, prior to this time and prior to the meeting, the police department or the village had Mr. Hull examined by Dr. Kyle Haneke regarding his fitness for duty. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what was the reason that you were advised was why this examination occurred?
Because the complaints by Stephen that he was dizzy, disoriented, and couldn't focus and couldn't function as a police officer.
And to provide yourself and the board of police and fire commissioners with a full understanding of the process with which you were taking, is that why you had Mr. Hull examined?
Yes.
This wasn't a unilateral decision by yourself, correct?
It was not.
Were you later made aware in early 2020 that Mr. Hull had begun working for the South Barrington Police Department as a records clerk?
I was.
You recall how you were made aware of that?
I was contacted by the chief, Tom Roman, who asked me if I could describe the circumstances in which he was no longer employed at Wheeling.
And were you advised or were you made aware that this was the same or similar position that was offered to Mr. Hull at the Wheeling Police Department?
It was a little bit more dynamic than our position because he has had a lot more responsibilities there than had he just been on light duty in our records room or in the dispatch center.
What did you think when you heard this information?
Well, again, it brought into the credibility issues and made me question the whole process of an attorney showing up pretty close to the time of his crash, a personal injury attorney. The fact that he never followed through with his doctor's advice on other doctors and other procedures, as he was describing to me, because my contacts with him were, I can't go see the doctors because the village attorneys aren't being cooperative with getting me approval to see these doctors. And the fact that we offered him a light duty assignment that he rejected and then accepted a similar position in another police department, found troubling.
In your experience, is it uncommon for an individual or police officer seeking treatment for a condition that is not covered by a workers' compensation matter, but is through the police department or the village's group health coverage?
I'm sorry, can you ask me again?
I can rephrase that?
Yeah.
In your experience, is it common that, let me strike that. In your experience, is there generally any obstacle to a police officer utilizing his group health coverage for a medical condition that's not related to workers' compensation?
No.
I make an objection to that. False, pure speculation. How would you know what other people's experience are with respect to medical treatment?
I'll overrule it. If you can answer the question, go ahead.
I can speak personally. I've hurt myself at work, been injured at work, and I go through the process of going through Blue Cross Blue Shield and submitting any claims to whoever my employer was at the time. And I've seen similar with other police officers.
Throughout this process, Chief Dunn, what is your opinion of Mr. Hull's truthfulness in his interactions with you?
Overall, I found him to be deceitful and dishonest in how he's dealt with me and less than forthright with his overall goal. His overall goal, which he stated to me over and over, is that he wanted to be a police officer here with me at the village of Wheeling, and yet he did nothing on his own to further that.
And is this in stark contrast to your initial interactions with him when he first became a police officer?
I told people that I thought he might be the next police chief here.
Thank you. Nothing further right now.
Ross?
Chief Dunn, again, my name is Dave Figlioli. I'm representing Stephen Hull. It's true, isn't it, that Stephen Hull completed his training early due to his ability to perform all of those activities in the training academy, isn't that correct?
Not because of the training academy, but he was excelling in the field training program here, and he was released. His release from the last phase of field training was accelerated. Yes,
And that seems to suggest that he was a good officer, self-starter, was familiar with the policies and procedures, and is able to certainly perform the job duties of a police officer to the abilities that the village would require. Is that correct?
yes,
And in fact, even though he was on probation, he was actually assigned to a special unit, a gang enforcement type unit. Isn't that correct?
yes, and he excelled in there to the point where he did such an excellent job. I recommended, and he received the Medal of Valor from the Cook County Sheriff's Office.
He had no prior instances where you were aware of his inability to perform any of the job duties required of a police officer. Is that correct?
Correct.
And he received good evaluations from his field training officer. Is that correct?
Yes,
And the fact that he may have been diagnosed with ADHD, was not taking medication at that time, again, that did not affect his ability to perform his job duties as a police officer for this department. Is that correct?
you're introducing new information to me. I don't know to what you refer.
Now, how many times did you actually contact Officer Hall from the date of his accident up to approximately the date he was evaluated by Dr. Deutsch in early December of 2017?
I probably had 2 telephone conversations, 4, maybe 5 text exchanges, and then in-person contact with him. And then also I had directed several people to communicate with him on my behalf on certain issues.
And during that period of time, was it your understanding that his claim for treatment was being processed through workers' comp during that initial period of time, 3 months?
I know his claim was being evaluated, yes.
Did you ever learn of whether or not the claim was accepted during this period of time, the first 3 months, whether it was accepted and whether or not the treatment recommendations were approved?
I don't believe it was accepted at that point. I don't believe they were approved, and I believe there was an ongoing process to see alternative treatments to what his lawyer's doctor wanted him to see versus what the village's recommended course was going to be.
And again, my questions deal with the first 3 months before Dr. Deutsch, who is the workers' comp evaluating doctor. Do you have any recollection or knowledge about how quickly the treatment recommendations were approved or not approved by workers' comp during that period of time?
I have no independent recollection. I would have to refer to my notes.
And did you recall ever having any discussions with the workers' comp insurance carrier, Ed DeBeal, or anyone else during those first 3 months regarding the delay in treatment that was recommended by Officer Hall's doctors?
I do recall speaking in person with Ed DeBeal and telling him that Stephen had been in contact with me, and he feels that he's not getting the approvals for the doctors that he wants, or that his doctor wants him to.
Did you receive any kind of response from Mr. DeBeal after that conversation?
That they would be looking into it.
And during those, again, after they looked into it, did you ever get any finality or answer with respect to whether they were either authorizing or not authorizing that recommended course of treatment?
My recollection is what I said to your question a couple questions ago, was that they were not going to approve his doctor's choice of doctors and choice of treatment, but it was another course.
And why was that? On what, again, this is before
Yes.
he was evaluated by Dr. Deutsch, which is the first doctor that the insurance company sent him to, actually the only doctor at that point in time So he had only seen Dr. Seno, and after treatment in the emergency room, and Dr. Seno recommended a course of treatment. Is it your understanding for those next 3 months that they refused to authorize that recommended course of treatment without any other doctor's opinions regarding the efficacy or reasonabness of those recommendations from Dr. Seno?
To the best of my memory, they did not concur with Dr. Seno and the course of treatment that he was recommending, and were recommending another.
So who was not agreeing with Dr. Seno's recommendations? Was it a physician?
You have to ask Ed to deal that.
And again, if the records are devoid of any other evaluation by any other medical expert, again, in September, October, November, so basically what you're saying is it's some adjuster at Dubiel or someone not a medical expert making that determination that they're not going to follow the recommendations of a treating brain specialist and authorize that care and treatment. So that's what you're saying.
I would object to that characterization. And I mean, this matter was placed in litigation within 10 days. So whatever decisions were not made by Chief Dunn. And I don't believe that upon advice of any attorney or adjuster, he would have to disclose that information.
I'm going to overrule it. Chief, if you can answer the question, go ahead and answer it. If you can't answer it, then indicate that you can't.
To the best of my recollection, Ed Dubiel was not making the decisions independently. He was conferring with his specialists and the doctors he's dealt with in past workman's comp cases and whatnot.
Did Ed Dubiel ever relate to you that he was relying on any doctor's opinions, again, during this initial period of time, to deny the treatment recommended by Dr. Seno?
I can only answer the question the way I've answered it twice already, and you keep referring to it back to the first 3 months. It is, as I explained it to you, is the best of my understanding of the time frame and how it occurred.
Have you ever received any documentation or any explanation from anyone, whether it's Ed Dubiel or anyone else, as to why they refused to authorize that treatment within the first 3 months and what basis for their refusal to authorize that treatment?
In this case and in no other case have I ever received that type of communication.
Did Ed Dubiel ever relate to you the basis for his denial for that recommended course of treatment?
I can only answer it again, and you'll chastise me about taking me back to the first 3 months. There was to my understanding, the best of my recollection, was that they being Ed Dubiel and whoever he was conferring with, whatever attorneys and doctors he was consulting with, did not agree with the course of treatment of Dr. Seno.
So you're not sure, as you sit here today, whether there was any medical opinion or whether it was opinions from the attorneys. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you ever relay to Officer Hull why his treatment was delayed in that first 3 months?
Yes. What I have just told you is I told him they are not in agreement. The workman's comp people, quote unquote, were not in agreement with Dr. Seno's treatment plan, and they wanted him to seek alternative treatment.
Did they ever relay to you what alternative treatment was recommended?
No, I don't get down into that level of, I'm not a doctor, I'm not his parent, I'm not his attorney. And he was already under attorney's advice, so I had to be kind of careful how and what I told him, because I could not direct him to do things.
Did you ever receive any documentation or information from anyone explaining what other recommended course of treatment was available during that particular time period?
Anything that I received medical in nature, immediately I turned over to Ed Dubiel, and I don't understand medical documents. I'm not a doctor.
So your answer is no, you didn't get any information regarding that.
No, I didn't say no. I said if I received anything, I passed it along.
Okay, so I'll ask the question again. Did you receive any information at all at any time as to whether or not Ed DeBeal or the workers' comp insurance carrier was recommending any other course of treatment other than the treatment recommended by Stephen Hull's doctor, Dr. Seno?
So I don't know if I received anything in writing along those ways, but as a staff, we have monthly workman's comp meetings, which Ed DeBeal is present and explains. We go down through each case in the village and the status and what the doctors have provided back and forth. So I don't know if he provided any written documentation at that time or not.
Do you have any recollection then in any of these meetings having discussed the scenario, the situation with Officer Hull, and whether or not information was provided to you about a different course of treatment that was recommended? Did you receive any information in those meetings regarding that?
Yeah, I did receive verbal information from Ed DeBeal about doctors and courses of treatment that they were not in agreement with the initial doctor's course of treatment. They wanted a different course of treatment.
And again, at that time, did they provide you with any specific information as to what that alternative course of treatment was that they were recommending?
Yes, but I do not recall that type of treatment. I don't recall what the medical terms were or what the specialties were, the special doctors that they were talking about.
Do you know whether or not Ed DeBeal or the workers' comp insurance carrier provided that information to Mr. Hull as to what other recommended course of treatment they were suggesting?
I don't know.
Would you expect them to provide that information?
Yes.
And if Mr. Hull were to say he never received any information at all whatsoever during that initial 3-month period of time as to why his doctor's recommendations weren't followed, does that surprise you?
Can you ask the question again? I don't understand the question.
If you can repeat the question.
Go ahead, yes.
Mr. Hall were to say he never received that information at all, as well as the period of time, as to why these doctors' recommendations were followed. Does that surprise you?
I'm not trying to be difficult. I don't understand the question. Does what surprise me?
That Mr. Hull never received any information of any kind.
Yes, that would surprise me.
And the only person I would think that would enlighten us as to whether those recommended alternative courses of treatment were offered to Mr. Hull would be Ed DeBeal.
Or Steve Hull or one of his attorneys.
From the village, it's Ed DeBeal making those decisions along with, as you testified to, you believed some other nebulous medical expert. Is that correct? So he would be able to testify to that, wouldn't he?
I believe that DeBeal would be able to testify to that, yes.
And I'm presuming if Mr. DeBeal sent documents to Mr. Hull about alternative courses of treatment, those documents or correspondence would be contained in the workers' comp file that he maintains for the village of Wheeling. Is that correct?
I don't know what Ed DeBeal does or doesn't do, and I don't know what he verbally told Steve, his attorneys, or anybody else. I can't speak for Ed DeBeal.
Now, you're not aware of specifically whether or not a particular physician, medical provider will accept group health insurance if a history is provided that the person was injured at work, do you?
No.
Do you have any experience, personal or hearing otherwise, where a medical provider will say, if you're injured at work, we're not going to be putting it through the group health insurance because that's considered to be a fraud.
Again, from personal experience, I have gone through the process of self-care, going to the doctor myself, and then have been contacted afterwards to see if it was potentially a work-related or is anybody else responsible for it. I don't think it's fraud by coming in and saying I'm not feeling whatever's wrong with you and seeking treatment because you have insurance.
And in those instances, you were specific that this injury or condition occurred at work and they were in agreement to bill your group health insurance carrier.
Yes.
Would it surprise you that some medical providers refuse to do that?
Yes.
Now, clarify for me, were you provided with a copy of the report from the insurance company's evaluating physician, Dr. Deutsch, at any time after that report was provided to Ed Dubiel and the workers' comp insurance carrier?
I may have been, but I never read any medical report beyond the fitness for duty evaluation because I can't evaluate. I'm not a doctor, so none of that had value to me.
Well, let me ask you this. Were you advised by Ed Dubiel or the workers' compensation insurance carrier that Dr. Deutsch had offered an opinion that Steve Hall could return back to work light duty for, first of all, for like a half day or 4-hour shift?
I believe that to be true.
So you were aware of that, and then that accommodation was made, at least initially, where he was working 4 hours a day for a few days in the dispatch area I believe, in December of 2017.
Might have been 18, 17?
Would be 2017.
Okay.
So you were aware of the Dr. Deutsch's recommendation of a 4-hour workday light duty. You were advised of that.
Yes.
Were you advised at any time that, in addition to that recommendation, that Dr. Deutsch had offered an opinion that by early February, Steve Hull could return back to full unrestricted work?
Yes.
And did you provide him or advise him at that point in time in February that he should report to full unrestricted work?
No.
Did you send him any documentation or any letter or order him to return back to work per Dr. Deutsch's opinion that he could go back to full duty work in February of 2018?
No.
So what you're telling me is on certain occasions you follow Dr. Deutsch's opinion, and in other occasions you're not following Dr. Deutsch's opinion. Is that correct?
What I'm telling you is that when we received Dr. Deutsch's, and I'm not positive it's Dr. Deutsch, I'm assuming there are a lot of doctors' names thrown around. I'm taking it that's Dr. Deutsch from that one. That was that he could return for light duty with these restrictions, and then that he could return to duty in February. All that changed when he couldn't even complete the light duty assignment. So that whole, in my opinion, that whole prognosis, diagnosis, and plan ended with his inability to even complete the 4-hour days.
So your interpretation was that he couldn't even work during that period of time, so no position was offered to him. Is that correct?
The light duty position was available to him. So it's, in my opinion, it would be like starting over, come here, light duty, and work. And we'll build from that.
And after he was unable to tolerate that light duty position, actually had to be taken to the hospital, did you or anyone from the department ever provide any notification to Officer Hall that he could return back to work light duty?
No, I believe prior to that, there was the fitness for duty evaluation completed somewhere in the timeline there.
Now, were you ever made aware of the fact that ultimately Officer Hall underwent at least a portion of the recommendation from Dr. Seno, a neuropsychological evaluation with Dr. Guidati Brighting? Were you made aware of that evaluation at all?
I may have been, but I don't recall.
And were you aware that that doctor also recommended a course of treatment and recommended that Officer Hall remain off work completely?
I don't recall the details of that, no.
Did you ever receive any response from Demeanor or the workers' comp insurance carrier as to, again, why they were ignoring the recommendations of that particular doctor after that evaluation?
Objection is the characterization, right?
Overruled. Go ahead and answer the question.
I don't recall.
Did they ever relate to you that they were utilizing any other kind of medical opinion other than the opinions offered by Dr. Deutsch?
I have no memory of that.
Now, you're the person, the chief that initiated the request for the fitness for duty evaluation, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And again, looking at the timeline, that would be sometime in September of 2018, isn't that correct?
You have the dates in front of you. I take, you would not try to deceive me with that, I believe you.
And if Dr. Honeke's report, well, actually, who picked that particular doctor or individual to perform the fitness for duty evaluation?
I don't recall. There were many people involved in this. We involved Villages Labor Council and our HR department. But there was discussion, and I don't know how we landed on this particular.
Do you know whether or not this entity that Dr. Honeke was affiliated with had performed fitness for duty evaluations on officers in the past?
I had no independent knowledge of this organization's past work.
And the purpose of this evaluation, I'm presuming, was to determine whether or not Officer Hull was physically capable of returning to work as a police officer. I'm presuming that's what a fitness for duty evaluation is that correct?
Yes.
And I would presume, as being the chief of police and agreeing to this and sending notice to Officer Hull, that you would rely upon the opinions of Dr. Honeke that are outlined in his report to then move forward with the determination on whether Officer Hull is fit to return to work. Isn't that correct?
It is used as one of the basis points, yes.
What are some of the other basis points then that you utilize?
Well, the primary one was Mr. Hull's willingness to come back to work.
So you rely upon the individual officers, at least conversations regarding their ability to return to work or perform their job duties?
Not specifically for this example, but if fitness for duty report says that if someone's fit to work and then you ask the person to come work like duty and they don't, well, there's no value to the fitness for duty report if the person won't work.
Well, did you have an opportunity to actually review the report, the fitness for duty evaluation completed by Dr. Honeke and Dr. Malofsky?
Years ago, or a couple of years ago when it came in, I did read it, yes.
And you were aware of the fact, were you not, if you reviewed that report, that the recommendation or opinions of Dr. Honeke and Dr. Malofsky were that Officer Hull was unfit to return to work. Is that correct?
Correct.
And they also made recommendations that he required additional treatment for a period of time. They outlined the recommended course of treatment. And then at the conclusion of that course of treatment, he would be reevaluated to determine if he could return to work in some type of a light duty capacity. Do you recall that in the report?
I do.
And to the best of your knowledge, did the village of Wheeling or the workers' comp insurance carrier follow the recommendations of Dr. Hunnicky regarding that course of treatment to attempt to get Officer Hull back to work in a light duty capacity?
I don't really know how to answer when you say the village of Wheeling. I mean, the individual, Mr. Hull, was not seeking the treatment, was not following through. There was no indication that he was doing anything to follow anything.
And I'll ask that answer be stricken as non-responsive. Again, my question is, do you know whether or not anyone from the village of Wheeling or anyone on your department agreed to authorize the course of treatment recommended by your fitness for duty evaluators?
I don't know.
Would it surprise you that no one authorized or approved that course of treatment recommended by your fitness for duty evaluators?
Would it surprise me?
Yes.
No.
So even though you're recommending a fitness for duty evaluation and you're relying on these particular doctors to offer their opinions on a very important issue on whether someone could return back to work or not, you're not surprised that the village or whoever doesn't even follow those recommendations. That's your testimony. You're not surprised by that?
No.
So is it your understanding that the village generally ignores doctors' opinions and does what they choose?
No.
How do you explain it? How do you explain their ignoring the recommendations of your fitness for duty evaluators? If you can.
In relevance, Chief Doug was not litigating these. These were not his decisions. This is so off.
No,
The reason why we're here.
I tend to agree with that. I'm going to overrule it, but Chief, if you don't know the answer, right, then just indicate that you don't, and then Mr. Figlioli, maybe we can move on from this point.
Waiting for an answer.
Could you read back the question? Because I know you don't want to read it.
How do you explain it? How do you explain your ignoring the recommendations of your fitness for duty evaluators? Strike a lot right there.
I believe they take the, okay.
Understanding that the evaluation wants to
I believe they take the totality of circumstances and all of the other opinions from attorneys, the doctors they're dealing with, their organization, meaning Ed DeBeal's organization, into account, and they make decisions from there. I don't know how that sausage was made.
So isn't it strange that decisions are made medically with respect to courses of treatment by attorneys?
Objection, that's not the answer that we gave.
Yeah, I'll sustain that.
The fact that this course of treatment that your fitness for duty evaluators recommended and that was ignored or not provided, doesn't that seem to suggest to you that it wasn't Officer Hall's decision not to get treatment, but wasn't it reasonable for him to rely upon the recommendations of the doctors you sent him to?
I don't know what into Steve's decision making.
You think it's reasonable for Officer Hull to rely upon the doctors that his chief sent him to for a fitness for duty evaluation?
I'm not surprised by that decision he made or didn't make. I don't know what decisions he made or how he made them based on the decisions of not following through with the other doctors when he wasn't seeing any doctors.
Now, again, were you aware of the recommendations of the other doctors that he had been seeing?
I wasn't aware of the recommendations. I just know recommendations existed and he wasn't doing anything.
Do you know whether the recommendations from all of those other doctors were either agreed to or initiated by the village or their workers' comp insurance carrier?
I don't know if they're initiated by Steve, his doctors, workman's comp, or the attorneys on either side. I don't know who was directing that. No, I don't know.
So if you don't know whether or not the recommended courses of treatment that Steve's doctors made were approved or not approved, or whether it was Steve's own volition not to follow them, how can you testify, which you did, saying you believe Steve was the sole reason why he wasn't getting treatment, if you don't know whether these recommendations were approved or authorized or followed by the village or their workers' comp insurance carrier?
Because he has insurance and he could have sought any treatment he felt he needed.
And what kind of insurance do you have?
Blue Cross Blue Shield.
And that's a PPO.
It is a PPO.
Do you have any experience with trying to get treatment through an HMO?
I've previously had an HMO and you need a referral.
And do you realize that, again, time is a little more extended to get to a general practitioner and ultimately then to get referrals to specialists under the HMO system?
I do know.
Now, isn't it true that the secondary employment policy was modified during the period of time that Stephen Hull was off work for this work injury?
It's probably been modified a couple times since.
And one of the modifications was, and my understanding is there was some degree of disagreement with the rank and file as to whether or not individuals on the department had to report voluntary positions as opposed to paying positions. Isn't that correct?
That's not correct.
At one time, wasn't a policy issued with the department saying that all individuals, officers had to report or get permission to even volunteer for various positions?
I have no memory of that. I have no memory of that. The only modification or changes in the policy that I'm aware of is, and that we've held off on, was indemnification from secondary employers to whether they would indemnify the employee.
So is it your belief that the policy has always been in effect that anyone that volunteers for a position, and again, voluntary means unpaid, that they have to get approval from the department in order to do that voluntary service?
The only policy that I'm aware of is that if someone is employed, and by employed means they fill out a W-2 and you get a paycheck, that I need to be made aware of that.
And were you aware of the fact that Officer Hull, when he filled out the information for the school district, that he completed a form where he specifically stated he was volunteering?
I don't know. All I know is that when we FOIA'd the school district, we received pay stubs that showed W-2s and the amount he was paid and taxes withheld and whatnot.
Did you provide that documentation to your attorneys?
I don't know what we provided. We provided everything that we were given. Now the initial part of the investigation, the internal investigation, was a phone call to Cary Grove High School. And the secondary part of that was a written FOIA with a private request. I do know that the form to which you refer, I do believe you did check a volunteer box.
And you recall actually reviewing that document or seeing that document, a part of that was actually provided to you on your FOI or
yes, sir.
Whatever?
Yes, sir.
And you would expect that those documents would be turned over to your attorneys
yes, sir.
For this proceeding, correct?
Yes, sir.
And would you be surprised that the documents that were provided to the board here, that your attorney apparently received from you, don't have check stubs?
I said check stubs.
What,
I said it was a payroll document that showed what his pay was and when the pay periods it was provided. It wasn't pay stubs.
do you know specifically or obtained any information as to when Officer Hull received a payment for that alleged voluntary service?
I'm confused by the word alleged.
Well, you're alleging that it wasn't voluntary, so do you, so I'll rephrase the question. Do you know specifically when he received a check from Cary Grove?
I do not.
Do you know whether he received one check or was paid periodically for the services he provided?
No.
Who made the decision to terminate Officer Hull's Pita benefits in August of 2018?
It would have been our HR department and working with the village attorneys.
Do you know the basis for that termination?
I don't recall.
But that termination occurred before the fitness for duty evaluation, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, you testified that you attended this meeting, and I have a date of November 28th of 2018 regarding the reasonable accommodation issue with Officer Hull. You recall your testimony on that?
Yes.
And in that meeting, you were there. There was an attorney, Paul Denham, and someone from the village and another deputy chief, correct?
Yes, sir.
And your testimony is that Officer Hull relayed to you that there was no position that he could perform, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And was that based upon the recommendations of his doctors?
He did not express that.
Did you ask as to the reason why he relayed to you he was unable to perform any type of job?
He says he's unable to concentrate and gets dizzy after a short period of time and couldn't perform any of those functions as we went through the various positions in the village.
And again, this meeting took place after you received your fitness for duty evaluation from Doctors Hunnicky and Milosky saying he was unable to work.
I thought it was he could work light duty, and we were trying to find a reasonable accommodation, something from them to do.
Again, according to Dr. Hunnicky's report, and we can sit here and you can review it, Dr. Hunnicky's recommendation was he needs a particular course of treatment, and after 4 weeks of that particular course of treatment, we will reevaluate him to determine whether he could work in some type of a light duty capacity, but prior to that treatment, he was unfit for duty.
And then he was also out of all benefits, and this meeting was trying to find a way to find a reasonable accommodation so that he could work somehow in some capacity and keep moving forward.
So at that time that you had this meeting, again in November of 2018, what doctor were you relying on to say that Officer Hull could perform some light duty work?
I was relying on the advice of Clark Baird Smith attorneys, Paul Denham, and how to move forward with Mr. Hull.
So your answer, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm mischaracterizing it, you were not provided with any medical opinions from any physician allowing Officer Hull to return to work in a light duty position of any kind at that particular time. Am I correct?
I was relying on advice of counsel.
So no medical opinions were provided to you?
I was working on the advice of counsel.
Now, you testified that there were these positions that were available that you relayed to, or not you, but maybe HR or someone else relayed to Officer Hull at that particular meeting that we have these positions available. Did you follow up in this meeting with any written correspondence of any kind outlining those light duty positions that were available to Officer Hull?
I did not.
Do you know if anyone from the village provided any correspondence advising Officer Hull that there were these alleged light duty positions available to him?
The positions were available, they weren't alleged, and I do not know if he received any correspondence from the village. I didn't create any such document.
Do you know if any correspondence was sent by any of the village attorneys to Officer Hull advising him that these light duty positions were available to him at that time?
I don't know, but I also don't believe so.
So if Officer Hull testified previously that he was not advised that there were any light duty positions available to him and did not receive any correspondence, that's consistent with your testimony right now. Is that correct?
No. It's not consistent.
So what kind of correspondence were sent to Officer Hull advising him of the light duty positions?
That wasn't the question. I believe no written correspondence were sent to him. You said that he wasn't advised of any.
The incident that you were aware of where he returned to light duty work for a few days in the dispatch area, did you observe what occurred on that particular day that prompted him to be transported to the hospital for an evaluation?
No.
So your testimony regarding what occurred on that particular day emanates from what other people told you, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, there was this issue about how Stephen Hull could get to work given his doctors saying he shouldn't be driving. And again, you were aware of that, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I guess the response was, well, you got to get here some way, figure it out. That's your response?
It wasn't figured out. He was giving out suggestions, yes. I don't know. I directed that he be told that he needs to figure a way to get here and told of the alternative possibilities.
And he did report for work on a number of days. Did he relay to anybody or to you that on a couple of those occasions he utilized Uber to get back and forth to the building, I'm presuming the building here?
I don't know how he got to and from work.
Okay. Are you aware of the fact that he did utilize Uber and attempted to get reimbursed for that and was denied?
I was not aware of that, but I would not be surprised that he would be denied reimbursement for getting transportation to and from work.
Even though his doctors recommended that he should not drive, you're not surprised that the village and their workers' comp insurance carrier refused to pay for transportation back and forth to a light duty job?
Correct.
Now, in the hearing before the Board of Fire and Police Commission, were they provided with a copy of Dr. Honeke's report?
I don't recall.
Would it surprise you that that report was not provided to them?
I don't know.
So if that report wasn't provided to them, those individuals on that board would have no information that your own fitness for duty evaluators had recommended a course of treatment that wasn't authorized or approved, and that Officer Hull was unable to return to work, whether full duty or light duty, until that treatment was completed.
If they did not have that report, they would not know what that report contained. If they did not have that report, they would not know what that report contained.
Now, you authored a letter initiating that proceeding before the board, is that correct?
Yes.
Did you provide the board with a copy of Dr. Honeke's report?
I don't recall.
So I guess I would presume that if the board did not have that report, then you didn't provide it to them. Would that be accurate?
If they did not have that report, I did not provide it to them in that packet, correct?
Do you recall whether or not you provided to the board members the documentation you received from the Cary Grove School District?
I don't recall what was included in the packet to the Board and Fire and Police Commission. It should be on record and should be available via FOIA. I don't recall what was in the packet other than the 2 or 3 page letter outlining the charges.
And if the board were not provided with the documentation that we have here today, one of them being that form that Officer Hull checked off voluntary, if that wasn't provided to them, they would have no knowledge of that. Is that correct?
If they didn't have that form and it was not raised at the meeting, they would not know.
Is there any other individual or entity other than you that would provide them with that type of documentation?
Steve Hall?
So was he told that he could provide this documentation at the hearing?
No, I don't advise people how to defend themselves.
Did you have any knowledge with respect to any accommodations that were made by the village of South Barrington for Stephen Hull's continued symptoms and condition?
No.
Were you aware of at any time whether Steve Hull had any financial problems with respect to his ability to pay for medical treatment?
No.
Did you ever inquire of Officer Hull whether he was having any financial difficulties and had these issues that impacted on his ability to obtain or receive medical treatment?
So, to the best of my knowledge from my conversation with him, he wasn't getting treatment. So I don't know to what bills you refer.
Again, my question would be, did you ever ask him whether he was having any financial difficulties that would preclude him from obtaining that medical treatment?
No.
And your position is, I guess, as we sit here today, even though someone sustains a work-related injury, they shouldn't wait for workers' comp to approve things. They should go out on their own, no matter the cost, and get whatever treatment their doctor recommends as quickly as possible. That's your position?
Yes, sustained.
But what is your position with respect to what someone should do when workers' comp does not give them approval for treatment recommended?
My advice to anybody is to follow your doctor's advice and get treatment and make yourself whole.
And that's all I have with this witness.
You need a break?
Yeah, just,
And the trustees might have some questions too.
Okay.
So do you want to ask yours or
I can wait.
let's take a break. Yeah, let's take a quick break. Slowly.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I will have some questions.
Okay, sure.
Just
Yeah.
so you know.
That's why
Yeah,
I didn't want us to forget.
just so you know, I would like to ask some questions.
Yeah, well, so we'll start off with.
Oh, of course. What's your time like? I mean, are you? I have no idea. Carmen, what are your thoughts here on this? Do your closings?
I'll stay as long as you want.
Yeah, I noticed. Jim, all of a sudden I looked over and Jim wasn't there. The other attorney for the village.
You know, my driveway is shoveled tonight, it's not getting shoveled tonight.
No,
Never like it.
that thing's gonna freeze over for a long time, it seems.
There's no way you're going to.
Oh, it's over. We have to solve that thing. Everything good with the new house, though?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Good. Good.
Bye. You know what I mean? Okay.
Let me talk to him real quick since we're waiting on more. Exactly right. Yeah.
That's what. Good.
Plenty to do.
But I'm gonna
That's what I say. Yeah. Really good, right?
No. People approach me.
Sure.
I want to do something. Do something
Only different.
The reason I do it. Yeah.
No.
And it is. You know, and,
Okay, that makes sense.
I had all my components.
Wow.
30 Fishman. I was looking. And, you know, and before I miss it, we gotta put it on the side.
Sure. This is part of it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, but, I wanted to do something.
Kind of been there and done all
My
this.
wife.
You're right back into it.
Yeah. You know, give up.
Right. Yeah. That's right. That's right.
I got it. It's,
It's you're part of all that garbage in.
yeah,
Yeah, you feel it.
um,
I don't blame you.
how long you got?
Well, 24 years in jail. So I got some time. I'm not, I'll be 46 next month. So I said, I got at least 4 years of brain age,
Yeah.
you know, to even think it quick. 20 years. And then I had,
enough to pay everything.
Right. Right. Okay. You're all set? Chief, I just have a few questions for you, and then the trustees will have an opportunity to ask some questions as well, okay?
Yes, sir.
Who is Ed Dubiel?
He is the village's, the company that the village employs to deal with all their deal with injury claims.
Can you spell his last name for me?
I don't know if it's DE or DU, BEIL.
DUBIEL.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
He's with CCMSI, the village's third-party administrator.
Thank you. Does the village have a permanent sworn light duty position in the police department?
No, sir.
I don't have any more questions for you. I'm going to open it up to the trustees.
Chief Dunn, I've got just a few questions here. Kind of to set where I'm going with my questions, how many years have you been in law enforcement? Approximately?
42.
And of those, how many years have you been a member of command staff in any department, not just Wheeling?
25.
So is it your testimony that you've had experience in dealing with workers' comp claims and disability hearing claims in a command staff position for some time? Would
Yes.
that be a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
Is it, you alluded to some things here, but is it my understanding that when an employee goes off and has legal counsel representing them, that basically as the chief of police, then your involvement in the very specifics takes a different role or a diminished role? Is that a correct
That is a correct
interpretation?
statement. I am to step away and actually any communication should be between the village's representation and the employee's representation.
Okay. And in your 25 years as a member of command staff, have you experienced employees who have gone on Pita other than Officer Hull?
Yes.
So pretty much is your handling of Officer Hall consistent with past practice with your involvement?
Yes, sir.
And you made some comments about the village attorney. You would, once it's out of, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth. I don't mean that. Once legal counsel is obtained by an employee and it's turned over to workers' comp, you stated you basically step back. You might be part of conversations, you might have involvement, but the final decisions, are they made solely by you, or is it usually made at a level outside of you or higher in the organization?
As a courtesy and an acknowledgement of my position in the organization, I'm generally included in parts of the conversations, but it's generally the attorneys and, senior village staff, and which I am part of and included in, form these decisions. And it's usually at the advice of counsel.
In layman's terms, could you share with the board here your understanding of any restrictions or constraints involving Pita, the Public Safety Employees Disability Act? Is there a time constraint tied to that process?
Yes, there's a clock that begins running.
And do you know approximately how long that clock is?
I don't.
Okay. Again, you've had other employees deal with Pita?
Yes, and they generally return to work within a very quick period of time, short period of time. So we've never run, this is my first incidents where we've actually run the clock.
Okay, so whatever the time frame is, this is unique in that it went beyond that based on testimony I heard earlier, that it exceeded that time constraint, whatever that is,
Yes,
correct? Okay. There was a question about Uber and payment of Uber. To the best of your recollection, has there ever been an employee in any of the police departments you've been involved in where they may have had transportation issues and had difficulty reporting for whether light duty or full duty?
yes,
And did the employer provide paid taxi service or anything of that nature in those cases?
this is my third law enforcement organization, and I've not ever seen it.
So, in your tenure in law enforcement, have you experienced, have any other serious accidents occurred to police officers during your tenure on the force, specifically to the department you were with?
Yes,
And they've worked through the workers' comp scenario prior and the Pita process as well?
yes, sir.
Do you know if any of them may have been under legal representation during that process?
They were
Okay,
at the end.
okay. And the last question I have for you, there was a question brought up about the termination hearing, which I'm not really sure how that applied in our discussion, but I have to ask since it was raised. There is a series of state statutes involving Board of Fire and Police Commission hearings. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
And it defines notice and ability for legal representation, et cetera, all spelled out in that statute. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
To the best of your recollection, when you proceeded into that termination hearing, did you in fact comply with the state statute? Or did you, and if you're not sure, were you advised by legal counsel as to how to proceed in order to be compliant with with state statute?
I was advised by counsel how to comply with state statute as far as notification and proper posting.
Okay, no further questions.
Thank you. Any questions from any of the other trustees? No. No? You regret?
Chief Dunn, after Mr. Hull's second return to the police department, you indicated that he would not come to work or would not find transportation to come to work, correct?
Correct.
So it wasn't that there was no light duty position available to him at that time. It's he couldn't work it because he couldn't come to the police department.
I did not speak to Stephen directly, but what was relayed to me is that he could not, it wasn't a matter that he couldn't get there. It's a matter that he couldn't concentrate and he got dizzy and couldn't function there.
So after meeting with Officer Hull regarding potential accommodations or new positions at the village, did either Officer Hull or his attorney or anyone from his family or anyone else contact you or anyone at the village with regard for clarification on what those positions were or what those accommodations were?
No,
And you never had any contact with Mr. Hull after that meeting regarding a clarification on what those positions or accommodations were?
no, sir.
I have nothing further.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other witnesses?
We do not have any other witnesses. We will rest.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mhm.
And for the record, the pension board at this time doesn't have anything other than pension board exhibits 1 through 41. We don't have any witnesses today. So from that perspective, the proofs are closed, subject to the pension board reopening them. Sometimes we'll go into closed session and the board will say we want some additional evidence. So pension board reserves its right to reopen the proofs once it comes out of closed session. But that being said, proofs are closed at this time. So now would be an appropriate time to make a closing argument.
if that's what the parties would like to proceed with.
Well, my thought process would be that if you're the board is.
My thought process would be if the board is requesting additional evidence, then I would certainly delay my closing argument.
And that's fine. I understand that completely, Dave. I just don't know what the board's going to request. So, I mean, we could certainly hold off on closing arguments. The pension board could go into closed session pursuant to section 2C4 of the Open Meetings Act at this time, discuss the evidence and the testimony taken in open session. It could advise me at that time if it wants some additional evidence. And if so, then I could come out, advise the parties, and then we would have to obviously continue this matter, get whatever additional documentation the board wants to see, whatever additional witnesses it wants to hear from, convene at a later date, take that additional testimony and evidence into the record, and then do a closing argument. So that's fine. I mean, if you want to hold off on closing, let the board go into closed session and talk about it.
And I would also, I guess, I don't know if this is appropriate at this point in time or not, given the questions that were asked by a board member, I would request that this board issue a subpoena to obtain the workers' comp file, and also consider issuing a subpoena to call as a witness Mr. Dubiel, who apparently is the individual that is making decisions on this particular case involving Mr. Hall.
We would object to Mr. Dubiel being called. We do note there was a subpoena to the village for all documentation regarding the workers' compensation claim, and all that was provided, I believe, to your office, Mr. Goodlow. The person making the decisions on behalf of the village was the attorneys that were handling the claim. So I certainly don't anticipate testifying in this matter, nor does my partner, Jim Frollo. And anything that Ed Dubiel would have been acting on was based on advice of counsel.
And I don't want to rule with respect to a request to issue a subpoena right now with respect to Mr. Dubiel. Mr. Figlioli, if you want that subpoena issued, then I would say put it in writing to the board, and then the village could respond to it, and then the pension board could determine whether or not it's going to issue a subpoena with respect to Mr. Dubiel. But at this time, maybe it makes sense before going into closing then is that this pension board go into closed session, deliberate, instruct me what, if any, additional documentation or evidence it wants, and then we can come out and inform the parties and move forward from that point. Because we haven't discussed this as a pension board. We're not supposed to until the evidence is in the record. So it's very difficult for me to comment on what my client's take is on this evidence and what additional evidence they think that they need until we can actually talk about it. So,
and just in response to Mr. Forte's statement that the board apparently received the workers' comp file, if I'm looking at the exhibits, exhibit number 24 is apparently the workers' comp claim documents, and it's comprised of, I think, 8 pages. So if you're telling me that that's an accurate disclosure of the entire workers' compensation file to this pension board pursuant to a subpoena that's only 8 pages in its entirety, I certainly would question that.
And in response to that, the workers' comp claim was filed within 10 days of the accident. And even outside of that, I don't believe it would be proper under any venue to provide the claim notes for this file or any of Ed Dubiel's personal information about how he was handling this claim, how he was communicating with attorneys for the village. And all of that would be subject to privilege. And when we received the subpoena, we responded to it with the information that was available outside of anything that would have been privileged.
And in response to that, again, it seems to me that a significant issue and dispute in this case is, and the references were made, that Officer Hall was somewhat non-compliant with his treatment, and that even the chief is saying he didn't get the treatment he should have gotten. And our position is he was precluded from that. And I would think that clearly the documents in the workers' comp file will clarify the issue of whether or not Officer Hall was deficient in getting his medical treatment, or in fact, as he testified to, the workers' comp insurance carrier refused to authorize this care and treatment on numerous occasions.
And just briefly in response, upon any request for authorization of treatment in this case, as soon as that application for adjustment of benefits, the Workers' Compensation Commission was filed, all of that came through our office, through Mr. Figlioli's office, and previously through his associate at that office. Ed DeBeal had no means to make any decisions outside of working with counsel, as that case was assigned to us immediately.
And I don't think it makes sense for us to go back and forth at this point with respect to this. Again, the pension, we're not issuing a ruling with respect to whether we're going to issue the subpoena or not. I think it's better if you want the subpoena issued to put it in writing, you can respond to it in writing, and then we'll go from there and see where that path takes us. But for right now, I think it would make sense for this pension board to go into closed session pursuant to Section 2C4 of the Open Meetings Act to deliberate over the evidence and testimony taken in open session, so they can direct me what, if any, additional documentation they want me to obtain for them. And the answer might be none, right? In which case we'll come back out and the parties can give their closing arguments, or they can say it's too late, we want to go home and give closing arguments on another date, in which case we'll reschedule to another date. But I think that's what makes sense right now. Does anybody object to us doing that?
Not at all.
I don't object to that.
Okay, thank you very much.
So entertain a motion then to enter executive session.
Yeah, it's a motion to go into closed session pursuant to Section 2C4 of the Open Meetings Act.
Second.
Is there a motion?
No motion. Motion by Joe Kopecki, second by Keith McIsaac.
Any discussion on the motion? If not, you need a roll call vote. A yes is to approve the motion to go into closed session pursuant to Section 2C4 of the Open Meetings Act.
Roll call, Keith?
Yes.
Joe?
Yes.
Michael?
Yes.
Tony?
Yes. Yes.
And I'm also a yes.